Welcome to Creating Disciples with me, Austin Roberts. Today we are going to be looking at a text in the Psalms. To be specific, we're going to be looking at Psalm 137. Now, Psalm 137 is a psalm of lament. And although we don't look at psalms of lament too often, perhaps you may find it unusual, maybe even a little uncomfortable, I hope we are ready to hear what the Word has to tell us today. So welcome once again. We are excited you're here. And it came to pass that the Smith family was on vacation. And they were on vacation in your town. They were on a road trip driving across the United States. And they came to a stop on a Friday afternoon. They found a little hotel to stay in, and they put up for the night, and they thought, hey, tomorrow we would like to go to church. But they weren't familiar with the area, so they thought, oh, we'll look online. We'll see if there is a church around here we can attend. So they got on Google and searched for an Adventist church and looked at some of the options in the area. And alas, they settled on your church. They looked at the website and they thought, this looks nice. They saw the pastor and they thought, man, this person looks like they could be a good pastor. They read the bio and they thought, well, we are excited. We're excited to join this church family for this 1 week. And so we will be there tomorrow. Well, they went to bed that night and got up ready the next morning. They got dressed for church. And the whole family, all four of them, piled into the car and headed down the road. They arrived 10 minutes later or so, and they stepped into church, a minute or two late maybe, and they opened the doors, and they went in, and the congregation was singing. And they thought, this is nice. They slipped into one of the pews. All four stood there with the rest of the congregation, and they also began to sing. As they did so, however, they noticed that there was a little something that was odd, a little something perhaps that was off in your church. And the son looked up to the father as they were singing, and he noticed the words. They were a little funny. And the words went something like this: when I die, don't cry for me. In my Father's arms I'll be. And as the son looked up to his father, he said, Dad, isn't this the song we sang at Grandma's funeral? They're singing this in church? This is very strange. Why are they singing this during the church service? And the dad looked down at the son and he said, Son, I have no idea. This isn't the type of song we sing in church usually. And you may look at me today and think, come on, Austin, we wouldn't sing that in our church. Those aren't the types of songs we sing on a Sabbath morning. And the truth is, you're right. Those aren't the types of songs we sing on a Sabbath morning for church. So I got a hold of a couple of bulletins, and I looked at some of the song lists that we sing. And I'm going to read you the names of a few songs, the typical songs we sing in church. They are songs like How Deep the Father's Love for Us, What a Beautiful Name It Is, Amazing Grace, Lord, You Are Good, Humble Thyself, Our God, Come Thou Fount of Every Blessing, Good, Good Father, Blessed Be Your Name. You get the idea. These are happy songs. These are the types of songs we like to sing in church. We don't typically sing sad songs. But let's stop here for a moment. Because the truth is, if your minister of music, if our minister of music were one of the psalmists, we would be singing happy songs, but along with that, we would also be singing sad songs, songs of lament. And that might feel uncomfortable, that might feel unusual for us today, but that was the reality in which the ancient Israelites lived. So I want to invite you today to step into that context, be in that place. We're going to be there for this time we spend together, and we are going to look at one of those Psalms. In fact, this morning I would like to invite you to open with me once again to the book of Psalms, and we are going to look at Psalm 137. Now, as I have already mentioned, this is a psalm of lament. And we don't know too much about the specific background, the specific context of this psalm. We know it's a psalm of lament. There is no author listed. So it's possible that it was just another Israelite who wrote it. We don't know too much about when it was written, although Babylon is mentioned. So it's likely it was written around that time, either during the exile to Babylon or soon thereafter. So we don't know too much. But we do know those few things. Now, depending on how your version of the Bible splits up the stanzas, there could be different divisions. But today, we're going to consider stanza number 1, verses 1 to 4. So we are going to read those verses together, and we're going to see what it looks like to see a psalm of lament. So let's read together. Psalm 137, beginning with verse 1. The psalmist writes this: "By the rivers of Babylon we sat and wept when we remembered Zion. There on the poplars we hung our harps, for there our captors asked us for songs. Our tormentors demanded songs of joy. They said, 'Sing us one of the songs of Zion.' How can we sing the songs of the Lord while in a foreign land?" So here we are in the first stanza. And if I took a look at that first stanza and had to summarize that stanza in one word, I would use the word homesick. It feels to me as if the Israelites here are in a faraway land, a place they're not familiar with, and they are homesick. And perhaps you know what that feels like. You know, perhaps as a grandparent, a grandfather or grandmother putting down a child to sleep, and that child is wailing for its mother. Homesick. Or perhaps you're in a different situation. You're a student at college, at university, in a place that is hours away, perhaps even states or countries away from home. And you sit there looking over your class material, and the tears begin to fill your eyes. And you know what that feeling is like. Homesick. Maybe you even got a job in a new place. You're excited for new opportunities. You're excited to set yourself up, to begin making some money, to begin moving along in your industry of choice. But every time you come home at night, it just feels so empty. Your parents aren't near, your friends are far away, your siblings are spread out, and you're just there alone. And that feeling is a feeling of homesickness. Well, if you're familiar with that feeling, you probably know what these people are feeling back thousands of years ago. They're feeling homesick. Now, the truth is, they are not only feeling homesick, they are also dealing with something else. You see, we read there in the text that the Babylonians there are ridiculing them. You can see it right there. They say, "Our tormentors demanded songs of joy." They said, "Sing us one of the songs of Zion." So not only are they homesick on the one hand, but they're also being ridiculed on the other hand. And that cannot be a good feeling. It would be like that grandparent putting that child down to sleep as the child wails for its mother, and that grandparent just laughing at that child and saying, "You are not at home, you're here, and that is too bad for you." Or that student studying far away from home, the tears fill her eyes, and a classmate walks by and just begins to laugh and say, "You are so alone." Or you, as you're working, you're beginning your job, and your coworkers, your neighbors, perhaps even a roommate, just laugh at you and say, "Well, you're alone, and that is too bad for you." And that's kind of the situation that the Israelites are in. They are not only homesick, they are also being ridiculed. So it's kind of a doubly bad situation. It's a rough situation for them. I remember back in November of 2011, I had just started college a few months before that, and I was enjoying it. I was enjoying making new friends, learning new things in different classes. I really liked the professors I had, and it was a good time. I enjoyed college. But I went to college in a place that was states away from where I lived. I lived in California, and I was going to college in Washington State. And that's not that close. To drive that distance, it would have taken probably over 20 hours. It's a long drive. And to fly, you can't even fly nonstop. You've got to stop somewhere. So in November of 2011, I came home for Thanksgiving. And the truth is, as much as I enjoyed college, as much as I liked being there, and as much as it was fun to make new friends and meet new people and have a good time, there was something about going home. It was just a different feeling. To be back where my parents were, where my sister was, where there were people I knew from childhood, it felt good. And I really began to understand what it was like to be homesick. And I loved going home throughout my college experience. Different holidays, Thanksgiving, Christmas, spring break, during the summertime, going home was a truly wonderful, enjoyable, and good experience. And again, that's not to say I didn't enjoy being away, I didn't enjoy college, because I did. But there is something about going home that is just different. It is just a fun and good experience. Now, for me, that was good. And college was also good. It wasn't like I was ridiculed. It wasn't like I was made fun of for not being home. So the experience that I have wasn't quite the same. For the Israelites, perhaps they were in Babylon. They were doing okay, although they felt pain for not being at home. And then the powers of the day would come in and try to crush them and squash them into oblivion. It could not have been a good feeling. I read a book a little while back entitled Shoe Dog. Now, Shoe Dog was written by Phil Knight, and it's his own story as the founder and CEO of the athletic giant known as Nike. Now, of course, as any company does, Nike started out very small. They didn't just immediately start out as the athletic giant that they are today. Today, anywhere you go, any kind of store, sports store, there is Nike material that you can buy. But it wasn't always that way. They started out just in a home, just a couple of them. Now, they began to have success, and Knight and his company were selling shoes, and they were beginning to become successful, and they were doing well. But at a time before they went public, at a time before they really hit it big, some of the other companies that were already big started to notice. Companies like Adidas, Puma, Converse, that Nike was a real up-and-comer, and they were beginning to really make waves in the athletic world, especially when it came to shoes. Well, they were doing all right, and Nike decided that it was nearing the time where they were going to go public as a company. And Knight tells the story. They were doing well, but they were operating at a zero cash balance. And if you know anything about business, you know that is not good. You want to have cash in the bank. But what they were doing, because they were still a bit ambivalent, they weren't on the most solid foundation, is they would take out a loan. And with this loan of millions of dollars even, they would buy hundreds, maybe even thousands of shoes from a factory in Asia. And they would get those shoes, and then they would turn around and sell them. And of course, they would make a bit of a profit, but with that money that they made, they had to go and pay back the loan, of course. And then that process would continue over and over and over. So they had to continue to buy more shoes, sell the shoes, pay off the loan, get a loan, buy the shoes, sell the shoes, pay off the loan, and it went over and over and over. Well, they were doing all right, and one day Knight says he received this little envelope, this little letter, and it looked fairly innocuous, and he didn't think much of it, but it looks like it was from some government agency. Well, he thought, well, it can't be that important. But he opened it, and as he opened it, he read what the letter said, and it said that Nike, the company, owed the U.S. government over $20 million in back taxes. And he was blown away. He didn't know what to think of that. He thought, what? How can I owe this much money in tax? Our company isn't even worth this much. Well, of course, he brought it to the other people who were high up in the company at that point, and they began to discuss it and try to figure out what the deal was. Well, they did some research, did some calling around, trying to figure out what was going on, and finally, they figured out what the issue was. They found out that there were some of the other companies of the day, the big companies like I'd mentioned, like Adidas, Puma, Converse, and so forth, who saw Nike as a potential threat. And these companies got together and they decided to do something. You see, they found this little used law in the American tax code that said that if certain goods, shoes included, were manufactured overseas and then brought to the United States and then sold, that duty or tax were assessed on them as overseas goods. But the law said that specifically pertaining to shoes, if there were similar products manufactured within the United States, that duty or that tax could be assessed on those shoes coming in from overseas at the United States rate, which is a much, much higher rate of tax. So what these companies had done was they had found this law, and they themselves had manufactured a negligible amount of shoes within the United States and then alerted the government. So basically, they had manufactured a few shoes here in the United States, and they said to the government, look, you've got to look at this law. You have to assess the tax or the duty to these shoes that Nike is bringing in because there is a very similar product being manufactured within the country. And so, of course, Knight and Nike basically went to legal war trying to figure out what to do. And in the end, they still ended up having to pay a fairly large portion of money to the United States government. And as you are, I'm sure, well aware, they ultimately became a very, very successful company. But what must that feel like? To be this fledgling company trying to figure out their way, and here you have the powers of the day, the Adidas, the Puma, the Converse, come and kick you while you are down. Well, if you're not exactly sure what that feels like, ask the Israelites, those who are exiled in Babylon, because they know exactly what that feels like. And it is not a good feeling. But you know, the text continues. The psalm doesn't end there. So let's return to the psalm and see what the psalmist writes next. We're going to read verses 5 and 6, and this is what they say. If I forget you, Jerusalem, may my right hand forget its skill. May my tongue cling to the roof of my mouth if I do not remember you. If I do not consider Jerusalem my highest joy. Now, the first stanza of this psalm, we summarize by saying homesick. But this is the second stanza. And if I had to choose one word to summarize this stanza, I would probably summarize it by saying the word remember. I think that's a good word to summarize this psalm. Now, I want to tell you a story told by the professor and preacher Fred Craddock. And Craddock tells of a time where he and his wife were on vacation. They're from Atlanta, Georgia, and so they like to go on vacation in Tennessee, in the Appalachian Mountains, where they wouldn't be bothered, where he wouldn't be recognized as a fairly well-known preacher and professor at a seminary there. And so that's what they did from time to time. They went on vacation. Well, Craddock says, this one time they were on vacation, they liked to go to this restaurant where you could sit there and the windows went from floor to ceiling, and he said you had this great view, not of the Appalachian Mountains, but of the Smoky Mountains. And he said he loved that view where he and his wife could be together without other distractions. And he said on this particular vacation, there was a man who came and pulled up a chair and began to talk to them. And Craddock says he sat there and thought, oh man, we are just trying to get away. Well, this man began to talk and said, hey, you all don't look like you're from around here. No. Well, where are you from? Atlanta. Really? Well, what are you here for? Vacation. Oh, that's fun. Well, what do you do back there in Atlanta? Teach. Really? You teach? What do you teach? Seminary. You teach seminary? You teach preachers? Yes. Well, boy, do I have a story for you. And Craddock thought, oh, come on. We just cannot get away. And the man began to tell his story. He said, when I was a child, we moved to this place. We weren't from here. And I was young, and it was many, many years ago. And my mother and I moved here, and it was tough for us. I didn't understand why other mothers wouldn't let their children play with me. And I didn't understand big words like illegitimate. But I understood the pain and the hurt and the loneliness. But I used to like to go to this one country church with this one country preacher who would preach every weekend, and I loved to hear him, but I would always go a little late and leave a little early so people couldn't get a hold of me, and so I could get out without being noticed. Well, on this one particular day, I went to hear the preacher, and he preached such a good sermon, and I was so wrapped up in it that I didn't get away. And the service ended, and the pews began to empty, and I tried to weave my way in and out of the people, but I was stuck. And that old country preacher was coming after me. And I felt a big hand on my shoulder as I was trying to get away, and I turned around, and I looked, and there was his face. And I was terrified. And he looked down at me, and in that deep, booming voice, he said, "Whose child are you?" And I didn't know what to say. And he looked down at me, and a smile began to spread across his face. And he said, "I know whose child you are. In fact, there is a family resemblance." And he said to me, "You are a child of God's. Now run along and don't you forget that." Well, the man began to stand up and leave. And this time it was Craddock's turn. He said, whoa, wait a second. Come back here. What did you say your name was? And the man looked at them and he said, "Hooper. Ben Hooper." And it was at that moment that Craddock realized that the great people of the great state of Tennessee had twice elected Ben Hooper to serve as their governor. And the text says, remember. Remember who you are. Remember what your identity is. It is children of Christ. And so now we move into the final part of the text, the final stanza, and I'm not going to lie to you, it is rough. So let's read verses 7 to 9 together. They say this: "Remember, Lord, what the Edomites did on the day Jerusalem fell. Tear it down, they cried. Tear it down to its foundations. Daughter Babylon, doomed to destruction. Happy is the one who repays you according to what you have done to us. Happy is the one who seizes your infants and dashes them against the rocks." Oof. That is a tough stanza. That is not an easy one to digest. And at the first stanza was summarized by saying homesick, and the second one by saying remember. How would you summarize this third and final stanza? And I thought about that for a while. And the first thing that came to mind was revenge. This stanza wants revenge. But the truth is, the Bible is about a lot of things, but it is not about revenge. And even though this stanza sounds rough and tough, I don't know if I would say that. So I continued to think, and the second word that came to mind perhaps was justice. God wants justice for those who have wronged others, especially the oppressed and the lowly. Perhaps justice is the word for this stanza. But again, I kept thinking, and I thought, although justice is an important theme, it's really not the end all in the Bible. It's not the biggest thing. So the third and final word that came to mind to me is perhaps one that isn't immediately apparent, and that is the word forgiveness. Now understand that although this stanza doesn't sound like this, if you read this book from beginning to end, forgiveness is a big deal. And in the story of the Bible, in the story of Jesus Christ, he invites us to the foot of the cross to be able to speak our mind in our deepest and darkest places. And I believe that is what the psalmist is doing today. And there are these three words for this final stanza: revenge, justice, and forgiveness. And the truth is, I cannot tell you how to summarize it. You're going to have to be the one to decide that for yourself. But here's what I can tell you. Depending on how you choose to summarize it, will tell me a lot about how you view this book and about how you live your life. So at the end of the day, the choice is yours. Is it going to be revenge? Is it going to be justice? Or is it going to be forgiveness? Thank you so much for joining us on Creating Disciples today.